Okay, today I'm going to be doing a series of videos modeling Punchy, the Hawaiian Punch guy. I'm going to start off modeling it in Blender, and this video is going to show a sped up process of that. And then I'll do a part 2 where I get a little bit more in depth with how I take the model into Blender and add in some more realistic lighting and materials. And finally, I'll do a bonus video where I take the final illustration and I put it on my looking glass display, which is a holographic portrait display. Really cool little device I got about summer last year, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. And it's pretty easy to take a final render from Blender and then put it onto the looking glass. And so I'm going to walk through how to do that in a pretty short video. I decided Punchy was a good subject matter for putting on the display just because he's punching forward into depth, and so there'd be kind of an exaggeration on that depth effect. So to start out, I'm just not doing anything different than what I typically do, just blocking in things with spheres and tubes, getting the overall pose down, something strong to work off of. However, when I got to the hat, that's sort of a tricky piece to figure out how it works in 3D. He starts off by looking like Aku from Samurai Jack, that crown on his head. Simply because Punchy, if you've seen his illustration, has a very flat looking hat. It's a very, what they call UPA style, kind of almost Picasso sort of interpretation of a straw hat. And so when you take these designs and translate them to 3D, that's kind of a big challenge, is how do you take these things that work really well in a 2D format and then pull them to 3D. And so I think eventually making a straw hat with the little spikes that go all the way around at 360 works. But I'm not really sure I came up with the best way to do that, so I kind of wrestled with that back and forth through this, to be honest. But I did start off with some tubes that go around basically a cone at the top. But I eventually ended up extending those tubes and then all the way up into the center of the hat, and you'll see that in a little bit. And then I remesh and kind of work it through. Speaking of remesh, I've now taken the sphere head and remeshed it and started fleshing in some details with my sharp brush that I like to make and the clay brush tool. And here you can see I'm going back in with that hat and I'm extending the length of those tubes to go all the way up into the center. And I'll eventually, I can't remember if I try to remesh it with those cones in there or not. But once I get to remeshing everything together, I then use the clay buildup tool and just moving things around to really get it to work. So here I'm combining the things together and trying to figure out the best way to make those cones work with everything. The cones really ended up not being a good idea here, but I think, remeshing and using clay buildup, I got the mass to work the way I needed it to. So you will see just kind of a lot of kind of wrestling through this idea and trying to make it work the way I wanted it to. Sometimes this happens. These aren't meant to be tutorial videos, so this is showing you even kind of the pitfalls of playing around with a method that doesn't work and then trying to force it to work. The good news is, usually if you just spend enough time on something, working with it, you can usually make it into what you need. So it served its purpose here. I got it into more of a solid cone shape, and then I started working the tubes around that and eventually remesh those together. The tube tool is one of my favorite things about Nomad. You've seen me talk about this a lot in my other videos. I think it's one of the best implementations of something like that I've seen in a 3D program. I really wish Blender would take some tips from this. Blender's Bezier curve tools work great, but I just really love the way you can do the profiles and stuff like that so intuitively with the tube tool in Nomad. So now I've remeshed those tubes in here, and I'm going around smoothing things out, and again using clay buildup and the flatten tool and whatnot to get the shapes I need, and pushing and pulling, moving things around. I think I probably spent the most time on the hat on this character, gave me a lot of trouble. The good news is it's such an organic form, and it's meant to kind of be scratchy, and I kind of made it look like it was made out of painted wood in the end, that you can really get away with a lot. It doesn't have to be perfect like something that's like machined or anything. So sometimes it's a good idea to just take a break from one piece and move on to another piece as you continue to work things out. So pretty happy with the forms I'm getting in the face. Just continue to accentuate that mouth and around the eyes. Here you can see I've added in a floor. I do that so I can read the shapes of the feet more clearly, because eventually I'll just trim those feet to be flat. And here I'm using spheres instead of tubes to block in the fingers. Tubes work, but sometimes there's a little bit too much complexity to them when you just really need these ovals for seeing the fingers and the thumbs. So spheres seem to work just fine. So it's really just a matter of, here I'm just kind of pushing and pulling and pinching, get them correct. And once I get them in a good place, I join them all together and remesh, and go in and use that sharp brush there on the creases to define the detail, make it look pretty good. So just making some quick work of that. Once I get the fist to a place where I'm comfortable with it, rather than just recreate it on the other side, I actually just duplicate the fist and mirror it, and then I move it over to the other one and swap it out. Here I'm using the flat tool on the ears. I like to use the flat tool to really just bring some character to a sculpt, some polish to it. Here you can see me duplicating the fist, getting it into a place I'm happy with. I've converted the tube on the arm into a mesh and remeshed it, and used the sharp brush and pinch tool and move tool to define the elbow and the crease inside the elbow. Here I've remeshed the feet, and then you saw I use the trim brush to cut off the flat part of the feet. And I like to mask that off, so you can see I've masked off the bottom of the foot so I don't actually mess with that. Use clay build-up tool to give a little bit more form and some flattening to the front of the foot. And you saw just for a second there, I actually inverted the mask and I pulled down the bottom of the foot just so there's a little bit more base to the shoe. And rinse, repeat, same process on the other foot. There's not a lot of detail that I put into working on the foot and the leg on this sculpt. Those are kind of really secondary to really the hat and the fist and the face of this character. Those are the most important parts of the sculpt. Always looking at my character from all angles, just trying to make sure all the curves and the lines are working harmoniously together. Here I'm using the trim tool to cut out a sort of V shape in the side of his shirt. This is something you can find in his designs, so I want to make sure that got added in there. And using clay build-up tool and flat tool to add some cloth kind of drapage around the shirt. Here I decided to mask off the eyelid and separate that out so it's a different object. So that way I could have more of a cleaner, more defined line between the eye and the lid. That way if I wanted to reshape the lids, which I did, it wouldn't mess up that seam that I had there. And I added the spheres in for the pupils. Get those in, and I just made sure he has those really droopy eyelids, because I think that's pretty key to his design. Is he looks like he has this kind of I do this every day look when he's throwing a punch. Very kind of laid back, happy look. He's punch drunk, if you will. I think that's probably the best way to describe his look and attitude and feel. Working in some shapes to the ears And again, that flatten tool, always love having that polish on a character. I really wish, I've mentioned this before, I really wish Nomad would add in just some overall mesh filtering like Blender has, so that way we could have like a polish, overall polish on a mesh. It would be really nice. I know you can take some features and just crank your brush size up. I'm not really sure the best way to do that to get like a polish filter, but maybe it's possible. And here I am blocking in the colors. Everything's pretty plain and simple in terms of color. Probably the trickiest part is what you see me doing here, which is just that secondary color on the shirt, which is on the sleeves and the main part of the shirt. I do end up adding some pink into his nose and his cheeks. And you'll see me do that here in a second. Once I get into Blender, I actually do a little bit more painting. I decided it looked better to give him almost some kind of dark circles around his eyes because it helped define the shape of the eyes better and added to that kind of punch drunk look. Constantly working on the pose as I see it from other angles, pushing and pulling things. Just, you know, reevaluating what does this sculpt need, what does this sculpt need most as I go. Decided to give some more attention to the hat here. And I noticed looking back at his art that hat is really thin and flat vertically. And so I had to kind of flatten that cone back down some more. And I went in with the tube tool and added some upper lashes that helps just really show off the shape of his eyelids a little bit better. Then I added some tubes in for his brows as well. And we're getting close to the end here. Constantly just reworking this hat until I get it to a place I'm happy with. Here I used the tube tool to create some hairs and duplicated those around. Something simple. Really, we don't ever see the back of the sculpt in my final piece, but you know, it's good to just have it in there so he looks a little bit more finished. Trying to add some of that wood texture with the clay buildup tool and some creasing. I broke out the Rizom brushes, which you may have seen me use in some other videos. Really cool brushes that you can purchase for download. They have some nice kind of natural media look to them. So I did try bringing those in for the wood. Ultimately, though, I think what worked the best was just that flatten tool, clay buildup, and sharp brush. And you will see once I get into Blender that I work with the material on this wood to kind of bring out some of those creases and add a little bit more into a normal map. So some extra fine detail in the bump and the normal once we get into Blender. So the one thing I've left out here that I think I'm getting ready to tackle is once I get the pose and everything worked in, here I'm just cleaning up my organization, is I wanted to have a splash, like a water splash around him. So here you can see I've got the tube, and I decided to use the tube tool to do that, playing with the scale of each point in the curve. And also I messed with the subdivision on the curve so it was rounded. But once I got that to a good place, I went ahead and validated the curve, remeshed it, and started using the grab tool to kind of snake hook grab out more pieces coming off of the liquid. And, you know, I really wasn't sure how well this was going to work, honestly, but I was really happy with it. And I think you'll see, especially once I get into Blender, that it worked out quite well. So one other little trick here is I made a group of spheres, just duplicated spheres around a bunch, and then I merged those spheres together, and I used a curve array that followed that same shape of the tube to get those kind of extra bubbles around the splash, the Hawaiian Punch splash, and that worked really well too. So this was a lot of fun just to kind of play with the gesture of the water or the punch. Here I'm adding in some final lighting before I do a final turnaround, which you'll see here in a second. But this is pretty much the effort here in Nomad. I was really happy with the way it turned out. I'm always impressed with the final renders people are getting out of Nomad. But at the end of the day, it's hard to beat, you know, a Blender render. So be sure and stick around for the next video to see just kind of where this goes. If you compare the turnaround that I have here to the final Blender render, I think you'd be pretty blown away. But I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out, even here in Nomad. Pretty cool here. You can see me adding some blush around his cheeks. And here's the final render. So stay tuned for part 2, where I take this into Blender and finally into the holographic world or hologram world with the looking glass portrait. So I hope you'll stick around and watch the rest of those videos. Hope you enjoyed this. Love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure and like and subscribe.